Hey everyone, Bradley Jack Design here with another design breakdown, this time my Baker Mayfield design for my 365-day project. I had a lot of people on Instagram and Twitter want me to break down this design, so I'm going to jump right into it and show you what it took to make this design. As you can see over here, I've got a bunch of different groups together in folders from background, back Baker displace, front Baker fire behind, Baker text sparks top layer. So I'm going to get rid of all of these, we're going to hide them all. Let's start with the background. So a lot of people ask me how I make backgrounds, and this is generally the same. I'll have a base layer of, let's say, the color of the brown, so any team color. On top of that, I have actually the brown stadium, so really I don't need this bottom layer, but it's there, so whatever. I have this layer which is masked to our square here with an inner glow on it. You can also use a vignette in the camera raw filter to add a vignette to it. On top of that, I have a layer that I use. I have a specific brush that brushes in these sort of lines. So I have this layer to add a little bit of lightness and orange to the top layer, or to the layer of the stadium. On top of that, I have another vignette. This is a stock image I have that I blurred and just set to multiply to add a little bit of a vignette around the edges. And then on top of that, I have a gradient map from black to the brown's orange that they use. So it just has this nice little textural background with little light spots, some spots around here, and the stadium itself. So now that we have the background done, let's see what else we have here. So this is the back Baker file. This is the back Baker folder. So in this, I have this smart object of just these two Baker Mayfield images that I have sort of masked out certain parts of to fit Baker in himself. So this layer I have set to displace, and this is using a displacement map file that is in this other layer I'll show you in a little bit. But another thing I put on here is I have this sort of fireball file that I have set to screen that I masked out these other fireballs. If you see here, there's actually 4 in this file, but I just masked it out, maybe stretched it around a little bit to fit the shape of this football. Since this is emitting some light, I have some other layers on here. This is set to screen at 30% where I just sort of painted in some orange, and that's the same thing with these layers here. So it's adding some orange around the edges, and this is actually going to play into more when Baker is here in the subject of the graphic itself. So next layer we have, or next folder, is back Baker display. So this is actually the displacing light that I put on top of the Baker Mayfield back file. So the reason that I have the displacement maps on top of this, this is actually the same file that I would use to displace that back layer. Now, displacement maps are going to be a completely different video that I'm working on to show you guys how to use them. They're a little complicated, but pretty easy to use overall. So I have this file set to displace, and then on top of that I have the same file set to screen, and just have a little tweaks to each of those each time. So the first one is set to screen with a gradient map on top of it of the brown's brown, or so it's black, brown, orange, then white. So it's just gradiating from black to white with some orange and brown in it. And the layers on top are going to be the same thing. This one just has a motion blur on it, set to 45 degrees, so this is roughly a 45-degree angle, set to 150 pixels. The next layer we have is turned on, and it has the same gradient map on top of it, as you can see here. This one is set to motion blur. I actually added another motion blur, and then I have a Gaussian blur set to, I don't know what, 20. So that's set to 20. So it's just to add more lighting to the back, these back two images of Baker Mayfield. So next we have Baker himself. I'm going to skip this layer and I'll show you why in a sec. So let's see what we've got here. So here's the Baker Mayfield file. Behind that I actually have this sort of fireball-y, explosion-y layer, just sort of a dynamic lighting layer that I have a levels layer set to get rid of the border around it to make sure that there's no edges on it. On top of that I have a gradient map that is set to white and orange, set to soft light at 50% just to add a little bit more orange to the file itself. And then to go with these displacement lights, to show that these are actually emitting lights, I have 2 layers on top of that which are going to add some lighting to the edges of Baker himself, and these are set to overlay and screen. On top of all of this, I have the text at the bottom. I think this is the part people like best about this graphic. So what we have here is a file I made in Cinema 4D of Baker Mayfield. You can Google and YouTube how to make 3D text in Cinema 4D. It's pretty easy to do. I might make a video on it later to show you how I made this text, but for now I'm just going to show you what I did to the text once it was in here. So I set it a displacement map to it, pretty much the same thing I did to the back here. I might have set it to more extreme settings, which I can show you in a different video, but for now I have this displacement map here. I actually duplicated this layer and set a blur to it, which will give me this, and then I have a gradient layer on top of that. And this is actually set to screen. This layer just adds another glow of the orange to the whole design to add a little bit more lighting essentially. And then just like we have on these back layers, I've got 3 displacement map files with the same gradient map on top of it, all set to screen, set to different things, a motion blur here, and then a motion blur and a Gaussian blur on top of that. So layering these levels, or layering these layers that are set to screen, are going to give you more levels of lighting to affect your design itself. Then on top of all of that, there's a bunch of sparks layers. So these are just some iStock images that I put around the sides. These are all set to screen, and I just sort of layered these on. This layer apparently doesn't do anything, so that's cool. Then we've got a bottom layer. There's more sparks here. Let's see what this one does. So I have some sparks coming over from the right, and I have some sparks coming over from the left. And then to finalize it, I've got this big light leak, this sort of rainbowy light leak on top of the whole thing. But I put a gradient map on top of it to color it orange. So it's just orange to black, so it's keeping the whole color scheme the exact same. Then on top of that, we have the top layers. So these this is just a gradient that I threw on here, just to have a sort of orange light leak around the edges to add more lighting, saying that all the lighting essentially is coming from this side, because these would be emitting light if these were actual sparks and there was, say, a fire going on over here. And then on top of that, I've got a color lookup of Foggy Night, and that is set to normal at 40%, which you can see darkens the whole thing. I didn't really like how that looked, so I added a hue layer on top of it set to plus 18, and that'll bring back some of the orange. So that's it. So it's just a couple displacement maps used on top of some text layers and images of him, duplicated a couple times to add more dynamic lighting to it, some sparks on the outside. The background you can barely even see, but it's better to have a little bit of texture than nothing at all. And then just some top layers to add additional lighting. I hope this gave you some insight into how I was able to make this design. If you guys have any suggestions for design breakdowns, let me know in the comments below. Other than that, make sure to like and subscribe. Thanks.